And basically, what he headed towards was an intervention where you offer like fairly intensive psychiatric, medical, and psychosocial supports for people in that situation. And you also get some, in the US, I think they're usually Section 8 vouchers. So basically, rent subsidies. Um, and uh, you give people choice of where they would like to live, like of course within the constraints of what they can afford with the vouchers. Um, and then you just help them to move in, help them get furniture, and continue to support them because a lot of people who have like serious mental illness, often addictions as well, uh, um, you can't just put them in an apartment and wish them good luck. It's not going to work. You really have to be there for them and continue to support them. So, so that's what that's how the Housing First intervention was developed. Another thing I would say about it is in terms of substance abuse, it's called Housing First because traditionally interventions for people who are homeless and who have addictions and often mental illness alongside the addictions uh, have had a philosophy that we might call treatment first. So um, you figure you got to help the person overcome their addictions first, because if they have their addictions, they're not going to be able to stay housed successfully. So Housing First turns that philosophy on its head by saying, well, actually, no, it's better to house the person first, and then we'll help them deal with their addictions. So the dealing with the addictions part is normally done with an approach called harm reduction.
I'm sure it's a lot easier to deal with your other problems when you actually have a roof over your head and a bed to sleep in, and you can see that changes are actually coming rather than having to do 10 steps before you can even get a house or something. I did want to ask again, before we get into the straight specifics of your study, has these things been applied anywhere? What was kind of the results that we see? Were there successes anywhere?
Well, absolutely. Way back in the George W. Bush administration, someone called Phil Mangano was kind of a major advocate for the Housing First approach, and it was adopted in many cities in the United States. And from there, it spread to other countries. There are many Housing First programs in Canada, where I am. There are Housing First programs in many European countries as well. France has latched onto it in a big way. There are Housing First programs in many cities in France, Portugal as well. Um, I couldn't give you the whole list of countries where Housing First uh, is found currently. It's really had a major influence. So Sam Tsimberis really was a very influential pioneer, and in fact, I think he was recognized for that in a number of ways in recent years.
So I know your study specifically focuses on the cost difference between Housing First and then the more traditional structure like seen in America to kind of highlight the offsets. And I want to get into the specifics of Housing First and where it cuts costs, but to kind of lay out where the differences are, could you go through maybe not, you don't have to give specific numbers, but maybe the different services or the reason why the current structure has such a high cost?
What you find if you look at the costs of people experiencing homelessness is that those costs, and by costs here I mean the costs of any incarcerations, arrests, emergency room visits, hospitalizations, ambulance transports, as well as the costs of their any health care they may get, beyond ER and hospitalizations. There are any social assistance benefits they may get in a US context, SSI, SSDI. When you add up all those costs, for some people, they're very, very high. They can be in the hundreds of thousands per year. Some people end up kind of chronically drinking way too much, needing to be taken to the ER by ambulance, being in and out of prison a lot, etc. There are other people, and this is less appreciated, I think, by the general population. There are other people who are homeless who actually don't cost very much. They'll live under bridges, in a tent, whatever. Some of them have paranoid schizophrenia, so they really want to avoid being near people. So such individuals actually cost very little. So if your listeners are familiar with what a histogram looks like, it's like a graph that shows the distribution of costs, how many people have very high costs, how many people have low costs. A histogram looks like a lot of people have sort of medium levels of costs, with a small number of individuals who are kind of the right tail of the distribution. They have very, very high costs, but it's really a minority of people with very, very high costs. So that's where we're starting. And then we introduce housing first. So we help the person to move into housing, but we're not just helping them to move into housing. We're giving them supports. Let's say if they have a severe mental illness, we're trying to make sure that they take their antipsychotic medications. We adjust the antipsychotic medications so that kind of the side effects are as tolerable as possible and the psychosis is brought under control as much as possible. So once you start uh, helping the person to have a somewhat more organized life, I mentioned the harm reduction. So we're also trying to help them, for example, not drink too much all at once, so they have to be taken to the ER. Well, when you start doing that, kind of you help a number of people have somewhat lower costs. And and one cost that you clearly are going to reduce is if people have been going to emergency shelters, then obviously they're not going to be going to the shelters as much if you've housed them. So that's an obvious savings. Uh, and most studies also find that you reduce ER visits as well.
Yeah, so that kind of did go into what my next question was going to be, was like, what were the cost differences and where were the greatest drops seen? Is there any other kind of places, or is emergency services kind of where the bulk of savings can be had?
Yeah, there's a number of places where costs can be reduced, and it kind of depended on which group we looked at. In the Canadian at-home chez soi is the French for at-home chez soi study, uh, we did randomized experiments of housing first for people who were deemed high need, who usually had pretty much invariably had psychotic disorders and who had other kind of functional difficulties, and for people with moderate needs. So we had, in parallel, we were running randomized trials for people with high needs and moderate needs. And we did this in 5 cities in Canada, in Vancouver, Winnipeg, which is in kind of central Canada, then Toronto, Montreal, and further east in a much smaller city, Moncton, where actually we put all the need levels into one because there just weren't that many homeless people there. So, and altogether, we had somewhere between 2,100 and 2,200 participants in that study. So by international standards, it was like a pretty large study.
And I didn't know going into it if it would be within the scope of your research, but what are some of the non-cost benefits you can see with things like housing first? I know there's probably obvious ones like people being housed stably for longer, homeless population dropping. What were some of the like more just not cost-oriented benefits you see from these programs?
That's a very good question. And there's a lot that can be said about it. And here, I mean, I've really looked at the Canadian at-home chez soi study results more closely. What we found is that we measured a lot of things. We measured like health outcomes, etc. We have some results that are going to come out at some point on where we looked at mortality in the two groups. And we found surprisingly modest effects. We found some improvement in quality of life, some improvement in level of functioning, but really not that dramatic. While there was an initial drop in employment, and we're talking from low levels, it was just a few percent who were working in both groups. Over the course of the 2-year follow-up, the employment rates caught up and were the same at the end. So I think it's just an initial effect. So anyway, the long and short of it is we didn't see that much effect using quantitative measures, but we also did qualitative interviews with a 10% sample of both groups. And when you start looking at what people said had happened to their lives over the first 18 months of either being housed or not being housed, then a lot more stuff emerged. And you see that actually a lot of positive things tended to happen to people once they were housed. Things like, gee, now I have a place where I can have people over, and people start making friends with some other people that they get to meet, and they can have them over to their apartment. They can reconnect with their families. We had uh, someone who described himself as having had like a happy childhood with a kind of in a well-adjusted family, but he got into drugs in his teens, and that started him on a descent that led him into homelessness. Now he was housed, and the team following him was able to arrange for him to reconnect with his daughters, his teenage daughters, who were able to stay with him in his apartment. That was very meaningful to him. Um, I remember reading a transcript of another person who started getting into painting, like artistic painting. And he was just quoted saying, like, there I found myself in my apartment, listening to a song on a radio, working on my painting, and feeling good. And that's an experience that kind of he wouldn't have had if he'd stayed on the street. Another sort of benefit that happened, and that pertains to cost too, is that in some cases, kind of the team following the person discovered they had a health issue that had been unaddressed. Like there was one person they discovered he had hepatitis C. So hepatitis C you don't notice for quite a while. It's just slowly damaging your liver. So it's if you want to live a long time, it's a good idea to treat it. And that's what happened. They at the time it required like hospitalization, what was called interferon B therapy. So he was put through 2 cycles of interferon B therapy, and the hepatitis C was cleared. So that actually costs some money. So sometimes getting people into housing first in some situations can lead to an increase in costs, but it's for a good reason. You're actually kind of making some serious improvements to the person's health. So, so the qualitative interviews revealed kind of a lot of really meaningful changes to people's lives that our quantitative measures were not able to pick up. So really, I think we have to look at homelessness as part of a larger problem of poverty. And while we can address that extreme form of poverty that is homelessness and help people get out of it, and some cities in the US have been more effective at addressing that, Houston in particular, Milwaukee too, as I understand it. There is this larger problem of poverty, and a researcher at Princeton called Matthew Desmond has been writing quite a bit about that. Um, and I agree totally with them that in your country, as well as in mine, we could and should be doing a lot more to um, kind of reduce benefits for people who already have a lot and ensure that people at the bottom have access to more financial resources. I mean, the evidence really is that, except for people with addictions, that obviously are going to kind of, they really need help, or if you give them more money, it'll just go to feed their addiction. But people who are not in a grip of addictions but are poor, as a rule, if you give them more money, they're going to spend it in a way that makes sense, that really improves their quality of life. And that's something that's been found like very broadly. So not just in the US, but even in developing countries, it's a very broad finding. Most poor people, again, unless they're in a grip of an addiction, um, are going to make good use of additional money that you give them.
Yeah, and if
So
we
the
went on with
study
the
looked at,
I was just gonna say, if we went on about the problems of capitalism and wage inequality and stuff, I'm sure we could turn this into a 3-hour video. Like that is homelessness is definitely a symptom of a larger issue. The analogy that I always like to draw is it's like you get a cut under your shirt and you see that your shirt is bleeding, so you change your shirt, but you don't fix, like you don't put a band-aid on the cut, your shirt's just going to get bloody again. It's the same with homelessness and poverty. You can house people, but as long as poverty still exists, more people are going to become homeless. So it's never really solving the root of the problem.
that's true too. Yes. Yes.
So
There's the whole issue of prevention of homelessness.
yeah, I agree. And the question I always like to end on with people who have done extensive research into any topic, and feel free to pass if there's not one that you found that meets the criteria or whatnot. But was there any findings during your research that were surprising or shocking to you, or maybe to other people that you think most people might not be aware of or overlook?
One interesting finding from our study that we did not expect was that we enrolled both people who had substance use issues and people who did not. And what we found was that substance use issues tended to reduce housing stability, whether you were receiving usual services or entered housing first. But the housing first intervention was about equally effective for people with substance use issues as people who did not have substance use issues. So that really contradicted the initial hypothesis that people have had, that really you need to deal with the substance issues first before you can house the person. So that was interesting. And I suppose I would mention one other thing that's not so much a research finding um, as like a personal discovery, I might say. And that is that when you start talking to people experiencing homelessness, um, you discover that on one hand, well, yes, obviously they are human beings, just as we are, just as deserving of care and attention as anybody else. But you also discover that the experience of being homeless changes the way you look at life in many ways. And it's a different sort of experience than you might think. And as an illustration, we once, a colleague and I were co-teaching a class on homelessness, and my colleague had invited a person who'd been homeless into the classroom. And one of the students asked him, kind of, kind of, can you, I forget exactly what the question was, something like, uh, what would you say is like significant about the experience of homelessness? And his answer was boredom. That kind of, when we have more money, it gives us an opportunity to buy things that fill up the time. In fact, we end up feeling super busy because kind of there's so many things we want to do and can do because we can afford to, whatever, play video games, go and see a movie, uh, go on a trip, whatever. But when you're homeless, you have virtually no money. So you're there on the street asking people to give you money in many instances, or perhaps you're not doing that at the time, but you just you just can't afford to do anything. So it's boring. So I wouldn't have thought that before I started learning a bit about people experiencing homelessness.
Awesome. And again, thank you so much for taking time to speak with us. It was wonderful insight, and I appreciate you answering all my questions.
Well, thank you for your interest, Brandon.